The morning she saw him again, Cecily Vane was on her knees. It was not the posture she would have chosen. The November frost had not yet lifted from the chapel steps of St. Crispin's, and the stone bled cold through the worn serge of her gown. She had knelt to retrieve a shilling that had slipped from the collection plate, the coin rolling with indifferent cheerfulness toward the gutter. She caught it between two fingers, pressed it flat, and straightened to find the Earl of Ashford watching her from the opposite side of the churchyard lane. He stood quite still. He was dressed in clothes that had once been good, which was a different thing from being well-dressed, and the distinction was one Cecily had learned to read in the years since her father's death. A dark coat that had shed a button at the third fastening. Boots that had walked more miles than their maker intended. A cravat folded and refolded until the linen held its shape by habit alone. His face, which she remembered as composed and remote in the way of men who have learned to keep their own counsel, was thinner now and harder at the jaw, and there was a quality of stillness about him that she did not recognize from before. The stillness of a man who has decided not to want anything for a very long time. In his hand, he held a ring. She knew it before she could properly see it. A gold band set with a small garnet, her mother's ring, the one she had noticed missing from her glove box 3 weeks past. She had told herself it had slipped behind the drawer lining. She had not believed herself. He crossed the lane without hurrying, and she stood and waited because there was nothing else to do. "Miss Vane," he said. His voice was low, and the words carried none of the warmth she might once have hoped for, and none of the coldness she had been told to expect from a man in his situation. "My lord," she said. He held out the ring, and she took it. And for a moment their fingers did not quite touch, though later she could not have said why she was so certain of this, only that she was. "I found it in the lane outside the apothecary," he said. 3 weeks ago. I had intended to return it sooner." She looked at the ring and did not ask what had kept him. She already understood. In the way one understands things one would rather not, that he had spent those 3 weeks working out whether he could face her. She tucked the ring into her glove and met his eyes, which were gray and did not flinch from hers. "Thank you," she said. The word was entirely insufficient. He appeared to know this and to find it acceptable. He turned and walked back across the lane, and she watched him go, and it was not until he had rounded the corner by the Lenten elm that she noticed the mark on the inside of his left wrist, partially concealed by the turned-back cuff. Not an old scar, but something pressed into the skin as a brand is pressed, though no iron had made it. A small crescent and key, inked or otherwise fixed into the flesh. The emblem she had last seen on the seal of the House of Ashford. She did not know yet what it meant that a man dressed so plainly carried his birthmark in his skin, as though he had decided he would not be separated from it, whatever else was taken. She only knew that the ring in her glove was warm. What she did not yet know was that the warmth had very little to do with the gold. It would take Cecily 4 months to understand what had been placed back in her hands that morning, and rather longer to understand what she was meant to do with it. This is that story. Her father had died in the first week of February, which was not a convenient time to die if one had a daughter on the verge of a second London season and no settled estate to leave behind. Cecily had understood this the moment Mr. Harwick, her father's solicitor, had spread the documents across the study table and begun to read aloud in the tone of a man who is sorry but not surprised. The house in Shropshire, which had been her mother's, and which she had believed, as daughters do, was simply her family's in the natural course of things, was entailed to the nearest male heir. The nearest male heir was a cousin named Reginald Vane, who was 37 years old, who lived in Dorset, and who had not set foot in Shropshire in 11 years, and had no plan to do so until the estate was legally transferred. There was a small income, a very small income, from a trust her mother's family had established. Sufficient for lodgings and modest food. Not sufficient for London, for a season, for anything that a young woman of 24 who had spent the past 3 years nursing a dying father might reasonably have expected to arrange her future around. She had moved into the rooms above the apothecary on Rydal Street in the market town of Keswick, which was as far as the small income would carry her with any dignity, and which was far enough from London that no one she had known in her brief first season was likely to pass the window. She had taken a position assisting the apothecary's wife with her correspondence and accounts. It was not a humiliation. She refused to let it be. The town had its own opinion on the matter. Mrs. Croft, who kept the milliner's 2 doors down and who served on the parish committee, had said it plainly to the wife of the coal merchant within a week of Cecily's arrival. She was nobody's prospect even before, Mrs. Croft had said, meaning before the father died, and the money went, though she did not trouble to specify. Now she is even less. The coal merchant's wife had spread this assessment with the dedication of a woman who has very little else to do on Tuesday mornings, and by the time the first frost arrived, the town had settled its verdict without ceremony. Miss Vane was to be pitied. Miss Vane was a charity case in good wool. Miss Vane was not a prospect. She was a cautionary. Cecily had heard this verdict in fragments, as one does, through the thin walls of her rooms and the louder walls of the apothecary's front shop, where opinions traveled freely between the bottles of camphor and the measuring scales. She had registered it without surprise. The surprise would have been kindness she had not earned, and she had learned to expect what she had earned. What she had not expected was the Earl of Ashford. His name was Edmund Carew, and he held the earldom of Ashford, which was in the north of Cumberland, not 12 miles from where Cecily was doing her best to disappear. She had encountered him once before, 2 seasons past in London, at a card party given by Lady Fernwood, where he had stood near the fireplace for most of the evening and spoken to no one with any particular warmth. She had known who he was, because everyone at Lady Fernwood's knew who he was, not from celebrity, but from silence. People stepped around the Earl of Ashford the way they stepped around a hearthrug they expected to trip on. Not unkindly, just carefully. She had exchanged perhaps 12 words with him that evening. He had handed her a glass she had not asked for, observed that the room was excessively warm, and returned to his position near the fireplace. She had told herself she was not disappointed. She had been a little. That was before she knew about his wife. The story came to her in pieces, as all the important stories did, through the accumulated patience of small-town proximity. The late Countess of Ashford had died 3 years before the London card party at the Ashford estate in the 3rd year of their marriage. She had been young and, by all accounts, vivid, and the manner of her death, a fever that had moved faster than any physician could track, had left the Earl in a state that the north of Cumberland described as grief, and the south of England described, more cruelly, as incapacity. He had retreated from London entirely. He had dismissed half the household staff. He had sold the London house and liquidated several of the smaller investments his father had kept, not from recklessness, but, as those who knew him maintained, from a determination to strip the estate to its functional bones and run it himself, as if work were the only thing standing between him and some conclusion he had privately rejected. It was the apothecary's wife, Mrs. Halliday, who told Cecily most of this, in the comfortable way of women who share a table over the accounts, and who have long since stopped performing discretion with each other. "He comes in for the camphor mixture," Mrs. Halliday said, on the morning of the 2nd week of Cecily's employment, setting down the ledger with the quiet satisfaction of a woman approaching an important piece of information. His steward used to come, but now he comes himself, every fortnight, without fail. He never looks at anyone directly, and he always pays to the penny. Cecily had noted this as a piece of local knowledge. She had not thought it would matter to her. She had been wrong. The first time she encountered him in the apothecary, it was not the ring, but a bottle of camphor extract she was holding, because Mrs. Halliday had gone to the back storeroom and Cecily was managing the counter. He came in out of the November cold, the same worn coat, the same economy of movement, and placed his usual order without looking at her directly, which she understood to mean not that he was rude, but that he had not expected her to be there and did not know how to adjust. "Lord Ashford," she said, which was not something she had planned to say. It was simply the accurate thing to say in the circumstances. He looked at her then. Something in his face shifted by perhaps 1/8 of an inch, not enough to be called an expression, but enough to register. "Miss Vane," he said, "I was not aware you were in Keswick." "I arrived in September," she said. "I did not suppose you would have occasion to hear of it." A pause, in which the fire in the back grate popped once and settled. "I heard," he said, "when I returned the ring." He paid for the camphor mixture, took his change, and left. She stood at the counter for a long moment afterward, holding a half-wrapped parcel and thinking that this was the strangest conversation she had ever had, and also, somehow, one of the most honest. She paused here, for the first time in months, and let herself feel something other than the low, steady management of loss. It was a feeling she did not have a name for yet. She would find the name later. If you have ever watched someone hold very still because they are afraid that moving will cost them something, you may understand what the next several weeks looked like from the inside. Cecily moved through her days with the careful deliberation of a woman who has decided that wanting things leads directly to the removal of those things. And she did her accounts, and she helped Mrs. Halliday with the correspondence, and she told herself that a man who came in every fortnight for camphor mixture and said 4 words to her each time was not a thing worth arranging her hopes around. She was not precisely succeeding at this. He came back in December. He ordered the camphor mixture and a small quantity of lavender oil, which he had not ordered before. She noted the addition without comment as she went to the shelf. The lavender was the kind used for headaches, or for restlessness, or for the sleeplessness that sometimes followed grief, and she had dispensed it often enough to know the difference between a household purchase and a personal one. She wrapped it without ceremony and made no remark, because some purchases deserve the privacy of silence. She wrapped it in paper without asking what it was for, and as she handed it across the counter, their hands came near enough that she was aware of the specific temperature of the air between them, not warm exactly, but warmed. "You are here very early," he said. Which was true. It was not yet 8 in the morning, and the town was still half asleep. "Mrs. Halliday is unwell," she said. "I opened the shop." He looked at the shop, which was cold because she had not had time to properly bank the fire, and at her hands, which were red from the morning chill. "You should not work with cold hands," he said. The words came out level, almost curt, in the manner of a command rather than a concern. "I have only the 1 pair," she said. "They will warm presently." Something moved behind his eyes, something that had the quality of recognition or of something recognizing itself. And then it was gone, and he paid for his purchase and left, and she stood at the counter and allowed herself, for the first time, to consider that she had not imagined it. The coldness was not for her. She had understood that in the churchyard, with the ring in her glove. The coldness was the shape grief had given him, carved out over 3 years of deliberate solitude, and it fit him the way a coat fits a man who has worn it in every weather, closely and without pretense. She did not pity him for it. She recognized it, which was a different and more careful feeling entirely. December deepened. The frost settled in the upper pastures and crept down toward the market streets, and the town drew inward in the way of northern towns in winter. The conversations shorter, the doors shut earlier, the smoke rising in straight columns from the rooftops in the still cold air. It was in this weather that Cecily performed the act that changed everything, though she did not know it was changing anything at the time. It was only the right thing to do. A child had come to the apothecary door, not an unusual occurrence, children being dispatched on errands in all weathers, but this child was perhaps 7 years old, and very plainly alone. And she was holding a piece of paper in both hands with the concentration of someone entrusted with something important. And her cloak was entirely insufficient for the temperature. Cecily brought her inside. She sat her by the fire. She read the paper, which was a prescription in Mr. Halliday's hand, for a tincture of valerian the child's mother had requested. She prepared it. She noticed as she worked that the child's boots had paper stuffed in the left one to cover a hole, and that her hands were chapped to the point of cracking. "Who sent you?" Cecily asked, settling the child more firmly in the chair nearest the fire. "Mama," the child said. "She cannot come herself. She is resting." "How far did you walk?" "From the cottage by Renwick Lane," the child said. "It is not very far." Renwick Lane was 3/4 of a mile. Cecily said nothing about this. She wrapped the tincture carefully, added a small pot of the calendula salve she had been mixing that morning, and then, because the child's cloak was inadequate and the morning was not getting warmer, she took her own Spencer jacket from the hook by the back door, the wool one she wore for cold mornings, and put it around the child's shoulders. "You will return it," Cecily said, firmly and without sentiment, "when your mother is better and can send it back." The child nodded with great solemnity and went out into the cold, somewhat warmer than she had arrived. Cecily turned to find him in the shop doorway. She had not heard him come in. He stood very still, in the manner that had become familiar to her. But his stillness now had a different quality. Not the stillness of a man withholding himself, but the stillness of a man who has seen something that has stopped his ordinary defenses cold. She did not look away. She met his eyes and held them, because she was not ashamed of what he had seen, and she would not pretend she had not been seen. He said nothing. He paid for the camphor mixture. He left. She understood, in the hours that followed, that something had shifted between them, though she could not have named the mechanism. She only knew that when she thought of his face in the doorway, she felt the particular quiet of a recognition long deferred, and she was not certain whether it was she who had been recognized or he. She chose not to press the question. She was not practiced any longer in the art of pressing questions. What she did not know was that he had spent the rest of that morning standing at the window of the Ashford steward's office, looking at nothing in particular, and thinking about a woman who had given a child her jacket in 12-degree weather without once checking whether anyone was watching. He had not expected this. He had not, it should be said, expected anything from Keswick. He had come to the market town for camphor mixture and provisions, and to conduct the small practical transactions that kept Ashford running on its stripped-back budget, and he had encountered instead a woman from a London card party who was now keeping a counter in an apothecary's shop and doing accounts in a town that had already decided what she was. He had noticed this, the town's verdict on her, in the way that people with their own experience of verdicts notice them, not with sympathy exactly, but with a cool private inventory of what was accurate and what was not. She was not a cautionary. She was a woman doing the hard and unglamorous work of surviving, with more grace than the town deserved, and more steadiness than the circumstances warranted. He had understood this when he found the ring in the lane, and he had spent 3 weeks sitting with that understanding and finding it considerably less comfortable than he would have liked. His wife had been dead for 4 years. He had stopped counting the months in the 2nd year, because counting had seemed like a concession he was not ready to make. He had her portrait still, turned to face the wall of the upper gallery, not because he could not bear to look at it, but because he had discovered that looking at it kept him in a particular kind of stasis, a state of preserved grief that felt like loyalty and functioned like a cage. He had not looked at it for 6 months. He was not certain whether this was progress or merely another form of avoidance. He thought about the child's jacket. He thought about it with an intensity that surprised him. And he understood, without quite articulating it to himself, that what had moved him in the doorway was not pity for the child or for the woman, but recognition. The specific shock of seeing someone behave exactly as they would behave if no one were watching. He had a steward, Briggs, who had served the Ashford estate for 20 years, and it was Briggs who came to him a week later with the information that completed what the jacket had begun. Briggs came in from the town with the weekly accounts and set them on the desk, and said, in the manner of a man who has decided that information worth sharing is best shared plainly. "The woman at Halliday's apothecary. You are acquainted with her?" "I am," Edmund said. "Mrs. Croft on the parish committee has proposed at the last 3 meetings that Miss Vane's position as assistant to Mrs. Halliday constitutes a breach of some propriety she cannot quite specify," Briggs said, "and that the committee ought to intercede. The woman has no standing here. She cannot defend herself through the committee's channels." Edmund was quiet for a moment. The accounts ledger was open in front of him, though he had stopped reading it when Briggs began to speak. He set his pen down. "What does Mrs. Croft object to?" he said. "Her presence," Briggs said, with the economy of a man who has said everything. "She was somebody's daughter, and now she is nobody's anybody. And the committee is deciding that this is a problem they ought to solve for her. By which I take it, they mean they intend to solve her." The committee met on the last Friday of January. Cecily did not know about it. She had not been told, because no one thought to tell her, or if they did, they thought it kinder not to. And the result was the same. The room was the vestry hall of St. Crispin's, which on Fridays became the parish committee room, and the committee consisted of Mrs. Croft, 3 members of her particular acquaintance, the Reverend Mr. Pride, and a handful of local tradesmen and their wives, who served in a largely decorative capacity. It was a room that had made several quiet decisions over the years about who in Keswick was suitable and who was not, and the decisions had stood unchallenged because no one of consequence had found reason to challenge them. Edmund Carew, the Earl of Ashford, walked in at 2:30 in the afternoon without announcement, and sat in the chair at the end of the table as though he had every reason to be there, which in the immediate and instinctive opinion of everyone present, he did. He was neatly dressed, not in his working clothes, not in the worn coat of the apothecary errands. He wore a coat that fit him correctly, dark blue, the cravat tied with an attention to detail that had been absent from his Keswick appearances until this afternoon, and he set his gloves on the table in front of him, and waited with a patience that was more commanding than any raised voice. Mrs. Croft recovered first. She was not a foolish woman. She had simply organized her world around a set of social categories that had always held, and she was now in the presence of someone for whom those categories had never been the operative consideration. "My Lord Ashford," she said, "we were not expecting you." "No," he said. "I did not expect to be here until this morning." He paused. "I understand this committee is considering the position of Miss Cecily Vane." Mrs. Croft's expression performed a small and private calculation. "We are simply ensuring," she said, with the smoothness of a woman who has said this sentence in many configurations, "that all members of the parish community are appropriately situated. Miss Vane is in somewhat reduced circumstances, and it has been suggested that she might find more suitable arrangements elsewhere." "What arrangements?" Edmund said. "Have you proposed?" The silence that followed was the kind that costs people something. "We had considered," Mrs. Croft said, "a recommendation to a domestic position in one of the larger households." "A domestic position," he said. The words were level, entirely without inflection, and they had the quality of a stone dropped from a height into still water. "She is not without education," Mrs. Croft said, which was a concession she had not intended to make. "A lady's companion, perhaps. Or a governess." Edmund looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Mrs. Croft, and she would say later to the coal merchant's wife that the expression on his face was not anger, exactly, but was the thing that stands behind anger after all the hot parts have been cleared away. "Miss Vane," he said, "is known to me. She is known to me personally, and I will ask this committee to understand that any matter pertaining to her situation is of interest to me in that personal capacity." He picked up his gloves from the table. "I will be calling on her tomorrow morning." He stood, and in standing seemed, without doing anything in particular, to occupy the room's attention entirely. "She is well positioned," he said, "at Halliday's. I would be grateful if the committee would permit her to remain so." He left. The room remained very quiet for some time afterward. He came to the apothecary the following morning at 9 o'clock. Cecily was alone at the counter. Mrs. Halliday was in the back storeroom, and the shop was, for once, empty of customers, and the fire had been properly built up, and the morning had a quality of still ordinariness that made what followed feel, in retrospect, as if it had been prepared for. He came in and closed the door, and he stood in front of the counter, and he did not order anything. "I attended the parish committee yesterday," he said, "regarding certain proposals pertaining to your position here." She was quite still. "I was not informed there was a meeting." "I know," he said. "I have asked that the proposals be withdrawn." She looked at him for a long time. Something in her chest was performing a very slow and carefully managed realignment. "You had no obligation to do that," she said. "No," he said. "Why did you?" He was quiet for a moment. His hands were at his sides, and his jaw was set with the particular tension of a man who has decided to be honest about something that costs him the effort of decision. "Because you are worth defending," he said, "and I was in a position to do it." The words were simple and specific, and entirely without ornament, and they landed with the weight of something true. She did not say anything immediately. She set down the paper she had been holding, smoothed it once against the counter, and looked up at him. "The mark on your wrist," she said. "The crescent and key. I've been wondering about it." A pause. Something shifted in his face. Not a flinch, but a turning toward. "It was my wife's device," he said. "The Countess before me. She chose it for the estate seal, in the 2nd year of our marriage. When she died, I had it made permanent." He said this in the same level voice he used for everything, and it was precisely that levelness that told her the weight of it. It was the voice of a man who has said something expensive and has not flinched at the cost. "I turned her portrait to the wall," he said, and then stopped. "6 months ago. I am still deciding whether I have done it rightly. It is not a wrong thing," Cecily said carefully, "to want to continue living." He looked at her. She held his gaze because she knew what she was saying, and she meant it. "No," he said after a moment. "I am beginning to think you are right." He did not linger. He bought nothing. He nodded once, formally, and left, and she watched the door settle shut behind him and felt the warmth of the fire at her back and the particular quiet of a thing that has been said aloud for the first time and cannot be unsaid. January ended. February came in gray and very cold, and with it came the information that Reginald Vane, Cecily's cousin and the heir to her father's estate in Shropshire, had sent a letter to Mr. Harwick the solicitor proposing that Cecily vacate even her current small rooms, which he appeared to believe were connected to the estate's assets in some way they were not. Mr. Harwick forwarded the letter to Cecily with a note in the margin that said simply, "He is wrong. It will not cost you nothing." She read the letter twice and set it down with the controlled steadiness of a woman who is very angry and is choosing not to spend that anger on furniture. She did not send for Edmund. She would not have done that. He came the following week on his usual fortnight schedule, and she handed him the camphor mixture, and she waited until the shop was empty, and then she said, without preamble, "My cousin has decided to dispute my lodgings." He looked at her. "On what grounds?" he said. "On the grounds that he can," she said. "It will be settled in his favor eventually. The law tends to accommodate itself to gentlemen with estate claims and inconvenient female cousins." She had said it lightly, because the only other option was to say it heavily, and she refused. He said, "Come to dinner." She blinked. "I beg your pardon." "At Ashford," he said. "Next Thursday. Briggs and his wife will be present. It is not irregular." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, steady and entirely unreadable in his expression, but entirely clear in his meaning, because she understood, by now, that this was how he said the things he meant. "Yes," she said. "I will come." What followed did not quite deserve the word courtship, which implied a social performance of a kind that neither of them was inclined toward. What it was a series of evenings at Ashford that were not irregular, with Briggs and his wife present, and occasionally a neighbor or two who Edmund had apparently decided to include because Cecily's reputation was worth protecting, even if she would never have asked him to protect it. They talked. The first Thursday they talked about the estate, because Edmund was direct and practical, and apparently saw no reason to begin with anything else. And Cecily had grown up watching her father manage the Shropshire land, and understood more of crop rotation and tenant rents than most women of her position were expected to. He had looked at her when she mentioned this, a look that was not quite surprise but was the cousin of it, and then he had unrolled the Ashford estate map without comment, and they had spent an hour over it while Mrs. Briggs sat by the fire and appeared to find the whole scene entirely unremarkable. They discovered, across the cold weeks of February, that they were more similar in their way of seeing than either of them had expected. They were both people who had lost something central and had continued anyway, not because they were unfeeling, but because they were practical. And the discovery that one's practicality was matched by another's was a more intimate revelation than it appeared from the outside. He never flattered her. She never performed contentment. The evenings were spare and honest and warm, in the way that a fire in a working room is warm, functional, and real, and not arranged for show. He showed her the portrait. This was in the third week of February, on an evening when Briggs and his wife had retired early and they were left alone in the gallery, and he turned to the wall without ceremony and turned the portrait to face the room, and the Countess looked out at them with a dark, lively gaze that had nothing of grief in it. "She was very alive," Cecily said. "She was," Edmund said. "She would have found everything about this situation correct." He looked at the portrait for a moment, and then he looked at Cecily, and in his expression, was the thing she had been watching accumulate for months, patient and precise as a tide. "I am not a simple man," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know," Cecily said. "I did not suppose you were. I'm asking something of you that has nothing to do with simplicity." She faced him. "Edmund," she said, which was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it in the cold air of the gallery was like a key turning. "Cecily," he said. And then, after a pause that held its breath, "Will you have me?" 6 words. Not a speech, not a campaign, not a negotiation. 6 words, and his eyes steady on hers, and his hands, which had been at his sides all evening, now extended toward her, both of them, turned open. She took them. His hands were warm and slightly rough at the knuckles, and entirely steady, and she felt her own hands stop trembling, which she had not known they were doing. "Yes," she said. "I will." The dinner at Ashford 3 days later was not the small practical gathering it had been before. Edmund had invited several of the county families, partly because an announcement required witnesses, and partly because he was a practical man, and he understood that announcements made publicly are harder to dispute. He had also, without informing Cecily, written to Mr. Harwick regarding the claim, and Harwick had confirmed in reply what Edmund had suspected, that the claim had no legal standing and that its pursuit would require an investment Reginald did not have. Mrs. Croft was in attendance. She had been invited because Edmund had decided that the architecture of a correction was most durable when it included the people who had built the original structure. There were perhaps 20 guests in the long dining room at Ashford. With its dark oak paneling and the candelabra Edmund had not lit in 2 years, lit now and throwing warm light up the walls. Cecily sat at Edmund's right hand, which was in itself a statement, and she wore the cream evening gown she had brought from London and never had occasion to put on, and she was aware throughout the meal of the quiet recalibration occurring around her, the small social machinery adjusting to the information it was being given. The announcement came after the second course. Edmund stood, which was enough to quiet the table, and he spoke without preamble in the level voice that was simply his. "Miss Vane has done me the honor of agreeing to become the Countess of Ashford," he said. "I wished you to know it, and to know it here." He sat down. His expression was the same as it had been at the committee, level and entirely composed, and Cecily, looking at him from her place at his right hand, thought that this was the most public thing he had done in 4 years, and that he had done it without hesitation. The room was very quiet for perhaps 4 seconds, and then the sound of it adjusting filled the air. The small conversations, the turned heads, the contained astonishment of people recalculating. Mrs. Croft's fan was still in her lap. She did not raise it. Lady Dunmore, who had known the Ashford family for 30 years, and who sat near the head of the table, said, quietly, but with a clarity that carried, "Well, that is right." And then she lifted her glass. The others followed. Cecily did not look at Mrs. Croft. She looked at her own hands, folded in her lap, and at the ring Edmund had placed on her finger that morning in the apothecary. Her mother's garnet ring returned to her own hand from his. She looked at him. He was watching her, as he always watched, with the patient and entirely specific attention of a man who has decided to see exactly what is there, and nothing else. "Thank you," she said, which was entirely insufficient, and which he appeared to find acceptable, as he had before in the churchyard, in November, when the world had been simple and cold. He covered her hand with his, once, briefly, and then released it because there were 20 guests at the table, and he was not a man who performed his feelings for company. Spring came late to Ashford. The kitchen gardens were still bare in April, when Cecily walked them for the first time as the house's mistress, with Briggs's wife beside her, explaining the beds and the planting schedule and the particular history of the espaliered pear tree along the south wall, which had been planted by the previous countess, and which had, according to Mrs. Briggs, never failed to produce. She ran her glove along the bare branch of the pear tree and thought of garnet rings and cold chapel steps, and a man in a worn coat holding something that belonged to her in the outstretched palm of a hand that was warm enough in November for her to feel through kid leather. Mrs. Briggs had tactfully left them, as she had taken to doing in the garden, moving ahead to inspect the kitchen beds. Cecily stood alone at the espaliered pear and found herself thinking of the precise weight of wanting that she had spent 3 years suppressing, the specific gravity of it, and how strange it was that the thing she had suppressed most carefully had come back to her not through any declaration or campaign, but through the return of a small gold ring to a pair of cold hands in a November lane. She had not been pursued. She had been seen. The difference was the whole of it. The mark on his wrist was visible that morning, the crescent and key, where his cuff had ridden back in the garden cold. She looked at it and thought of the portrait in the gallery, which they had turned to face the room and left there, because that was right. And she thought of the small crescent shape that a ring leaves on a finger kept long enough. Her own ring was back where it belonged. The garnet caught the thin April light and held it. Inside the house, the fire in the morning room had been built up by the time they came in from the garden, and Edmund was standing at the window in his shirt sleeves, which was not how he stood in public, but was entirely how he stood here, which was private, which was home. He did not turn when she came in, because he knew the sound of her steps, and when she stood beside him at the window, he moved slightly to admit her, a small practical shifting that contained within it everything the 6 words in the gallery had contained, which was to say, everything. They stood at the window, and the April garden was bare and cold and full of what was coming, and the fire was warm at their backs, and the pear tree's gray branches were as full of April as bare branches are, which is entirely full. Thank you for staying with this story. If Cecily's quiet courage moved you, I hope you will carry it with you a little while. She did not become the Countess of Ashford because she had claimed it, or maneuvered for it, or made herself what the world required. She became it because a man who had learned to look accurately saw her plainly, in a doorway, giving away her jacket in the cold, and understood that what he was looking at was worth everything the word home has ever meant. The garnet ring stayed warm,